Okay, so last lecture I said we would start talking about the form of arguments and how to evaluate them in this lecture. One thing we need to do first, though, is to talk about deductive arguments versus inductive arguments. And to do that, to really understand that, we need to talk about this concept of validity, which is a concept that only applies to deductive arguments. And we'll talk in this lecture a lot more about deductive arguments. Those are what the book is focused on. We'll talk a lot more about deductive arguments in this class than we will inductive. We might touch on inductive a little bit toward the end of the class, but we will mostly focus on deductive reasoning. And I'll say a little bit more about why that is, at the end of the lecture today. But so to begin with, let's talk about this concept of validity. And one thing I want to say is I'm going to be a stickler about this term. When we talk about an argument being valid, we mean something very specific. Look, I know we use this term in other ways outside of class. If you say somebody has a valid argument, you might mean that it's convincing, it's compelling, you think it's pretty good. We, in logic, have a very precise meaning for what validity is and what it means. Well, the first thing to say is that validity is about the form of a deductive argument. Validity is when a deductive argument has a good form, you might say. I know that's really super imprecise, but we'll try to narrow that down and make it precise. One thing to note is validity is all or nothing. I'll emphasize that a lot more. It's a sort of 1 or 0 kind of thing. What then does the validity mean? Well, to say that a deductive argument is valid means that one cannot even imagine a way that the premises could be true and the conclusion false. If the premises are true and the argument is valid, the conclusion must be true as well. Deductive means true premises, conclusion has to be true as well. If you assume the premises are true, it's impossible to deny the conclusion as well if the argument is valid. You cannot even imagine a way that the premises could be true and the conclusion false. Let me give you guys some examples of valid deductive arguments. You see deductive arguments in math a lot. They're the bread and butter of mathematics. Think about, if you remember any of your high school geometry, parallel lines run next to each other, they're straight, they never cross. Should have a little diagram here, but if lines A and B really are parallel, they will never cross, right? Valid deductive argument, parallel lines don't cross. If these lines are parallel, they'll never cross. Any number that can be divided by 2 with nothing left over is even. 76 can be divided by 2 with nothing left over, so 76 is even, right? You cannot even imagine a way, if these two random lines really are parallel, you cannot even imagine a way that this conclusion could be false and they actually cross, right? If you're imagining them crossing, then you're not imagining parallel lines. You're not getting the premises right. If the premises are true, conclusion has to be true as well. Look. You picture a bunch of dots, even number of dots on each side if you divide them in half. If you think there's more on one side than the other, you're not really imagining 76 of them. If you're imagining 76, it has to be true. You can divide it into half, right? 38, right? Another example of a valid argument, Elmo is red all over, right? So Elmo isn't blue all over, right? If something is all one color, if all of Elmo is red, Elmo can't also be blue all over. Red, blue, things are one or the other, right? This is a valid argument. Here's another one. All Muppets are fictional characters. Elmo is a Muppet, so Elmo is a fictional character, right? You know, if Muppets are in fact fictional characters, then anything that is a Muppet is also fictional, right? Here's another one. No person who is under 40 can legally become president. Andrew is 36, so Andrew cannot legally become U.S. president, right? If it's really true that nobody under 40 can become president, and he's under 40, he cannot become president, at least not legally, right? Now, I'm going to guess that some of you are like, wait a minute with this argument. Might be a reason you're pushing back on this one. You might, well, we'll come back to it, right? Keep this one in mind. We will come back to it. No mammals have scales. All trout have scales. No trout are mammals, right? The way mammals are defined, we have fur. We don't have scales. Trout have scales, so they're not a mammal, right? Now, here is where this concept of validity gets very tricky. Remember I said that logic is about the structure of arguments, how the premises fit together, not whether the premises are themselves good or bad, true or not. Well, validity is all about structure. It tells us absolutely nothing about whether the premises are true. So think back, this was deliberate on my part. I'm not stupid. I do remember my high school civics class. The first premise here is actually false, right? We don't know this Andrew guy, I'm thinking of a friend of mine named Andrew, but this isn't really the Andrew that's here. This is just made up, right? But as a matter of fact, the age to legally become president is 35. It's not 40. This first premise is false. But it's still valid because remember, validity is not about whether the premises are true or false. It's just about if they are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. Look, if the Constitution really were written so that you have to be 40 to become president, then somebody who's 36 really could not legally become president. We are not asking if these premises are true. Premise number one is not. We're asking if we accept these premises, do we have to accept the conclusion as well? Different thing than are the premises true. And so we might think that there's 4 different possibilities here. Look, as far as an argument and the premises go, the premises could all be true and the conclusion true. The premises could all be true and the conclusion false. Some or all the premises could be false and the conclusion false. And finally, some or all of the premises could be false and the conclusion could be true. To say an argument's valid only rules out one of these. It rules out number 2. A valid argument cannot have true premises and a false conclusion. That's the only thing we're ruling out. So, a valid argument can have all true premises and cannot have all true premises and a false conclusion. Every other possibility is open, though. Here's a valid argument with true premises and a true conclusion. Platypuses are platypuses are mammals. Platypuses lay eggs. Therefore, some mammals lay eggs. True premises, they are in fact mammals. They do lay eggs. True conclusion, right? Here's one that's some false premises and a false conclusion. Any animal that nurses its young with milk is a mammal. Penguins nurse their young with milk, so penguins are mammals, right? First premise, this any animal that nurses its young is true. That's just the definition of what a mammal is. It's false that penguins do this, and it's false that penguins are mammals, right? This is a valid argument. If penguins really did do this, they really would be mammals, right? By the definition, if you remember your high school biology of what a mammal is, right? False premises, false conclusion. Or sorry, false premises and true conclusion. All mammals are warm-blooded. That's true. Penguins are mammals. That's not. That's our false premise. Therefore, penguins are warm-blooded. That's our conclusion. That they actually are warm-blooded. Birds are warm-blooded. We have at least one false premise and a true conclusion. That possibility is not ruled out. Look, validity is only about structure, not about whether the premises are actually true. This is something I'm going to repeat over and over because it's something people have trouble with. Validity is a tricky concept for a lot of people. We don't need to look at whether the premises are true or not. We just need to think about if they were true, would they make the conclusion true as well? And there's a reason that we think about things in this way, and we'll talk more about this because it actually saves us a lot of work because we don't have to think about the truth of the conclusion at all. We get to a certain point when we won't even look at what the premises and conclusion are saying. We will just look entirely at the form of the argument. All right. One more thing to say. We will look, especially in the next chapter, at arguments that have more than one step. And each step of an argument should be valid. Valid inference steps in an argument, you go from a couple premises, sometimes even just one premise, to a conclusion or another premise. If the steps are valid, then if these premises are true, whatever you move to after has to be true as well. An argument that only, if the step from these premises to this conclusion leaves no room for doubt, it's a valid step. Either Professor Plum or Mrs. White killed Mr. Body. Mr. White didn't do it, didn't kill Mr. Body, so Professor Plum did it, right? Mrs. White didn't do it. Given these two premises, this, conclusion has to be true. This is a valid step, right? We're looking at arguments that only have like two premises and a conclusion so far. Some will have a lot more premises and a lot more steps in them, but each step needs to be valid. If each step in the argument is valid, the argument itself is valid. Valid step from premises to this conclusion is one that leaves no room for doubt. If Professor Plum did it, if either Professor Plum or Mrs. White did it, and Mrs. White didn't do it, then Professor Plum did, right? So one more bit of jargon here that's actually important. Smith talks about this, but we're not going to talk about it too much. It's important to know what this is. It's not going to play a huge role in the class, is this idea of a sound deductive argument, or soundness in argument. A sound deductive argument is one that is valid, and it also has all true premises. If it's valid and every single premise is true, then it is sound. Now, we are actually not going to talk too much about soundness. Why not? Well, remember, I said we are not in the business of deciding whether premises are true or not. I'm not going to claim any special expertise on, any of the premises we talk about being true. Even if I had it, that's not the purpose of the class. This class is all about the structure of arguments, right? So we are going to be much more interested when we talk about deductive arguments in this concept of validity. Soundness, we're not going to care about very much. A lot of the arguments we're going to talk about are just made up ones. These people don't even exist. So we are going to be worried much more about this concept of validity. Now, one thing I will say to you guys, and we will practice validity a lot, and I'm going to hammer it home what it is, because validity is actually a really tricky concept. It's one that causes people a lot of trouble. Why is that? Well, validity, we're only thinking about the structure of the argument. We're only thinking about not whether the premises are true, but whether if they were true, they would make the conclusion true as well. Are these premises consistent with the conclusion being false? Only if they're not is the argument valid. And the mind is not naturally set up to think this way. We don't think about the structure of an argument and what the argument says separately. We naturally think of the premises, whether they're true or not, as well as the structure. We think of the two together. This is actually something you really have to train yourself to do. It's hard. We will practice. There's all kinds of studies that indicate, that show that this does not come naturally to people. People, do not naturally separate the truth of the premises from what the argument would show if the premises were true. There's even a study, they did this study in Russia, where they were talking to people, in this one part of the country that was fairly isolated, and they would give them these cases, that dealt with this concept of validity, and they'd say, well, look, suppose I told you that all the bears in the north were white. Ivan lives in the north, and he sees a bear. What color is the bear that Ivan sees? And these people would actually say, how do I know? I've never been there. And they'd say, well, yeah, but imagine, imagine, just accept that it's true that in the north all the bears are white, and this guy Ivan lives there. If Ivan sees a bear, what color is it? And these people would get mad at the scientists. They're like, how in the world am I supposed to know? I've never been there. I've never seen a bear in the north. I don't know what they look like. This idea of like, hey, accept this weird thing, bears up there white, and if bears up there white and this guy sees a bear, what color is it? Very, very simple, it seems, but these people had huge problems with it. This idea that you accept something that you don't know whether it's true or not, and you just reason from it. You're like, okay, if this is true, if this weird thing is true, well, what else is true because of it? And that's some of what I'm asking you to do when we think about this concept of validity, right? If you remember high school civics, you remember, well, the Constitution says if you're over 35, natural born citizen, and some other stuff, you can become president. And I say, well, suppose the Constitution said you had to be 45, right? Or 40 or whatever. Then what would follow from that? You know that to be false. Or maybe you don't know anything. If you don't remember high school civics, you might say, well, I don't know what the Constitution says. But I say, well, if things were this way, then what else would follow from it, right? We think about this poor Russian peasant and we're like, oh my gosh, he's dumb, right? Obviously, if we say, well, in the north, the bears are purple, which is false. Ivan lives in the north and he sees a bear. What color is the bear? You say, well, if we accept that it's purple, okay. Right, we laugh because that's an easy step for us. But when we get into things, when I give you problems, and I will do this, where it's like ridiculously stupid premises, but the form of the argument's good, you are probably going to have problems with it, because this idea of, well, don't think about the truth of the premises, just see what would also be true if they were true. That is a thing that is hard for people. Anyway, in validity, when we talk about validity, we are focusing only on form or structure, and again, that is hard. It does not come natural to people, at least not most people. You will have to practice with it. Now, we're not going to focus as much on inductive arguments, but I do want to say a bit about them just so you know what they are. They're actually rather important. We just can't do everything we might want to do in a class like this, right? Inductive arguments, one way to put this is inductive arguments are risky. No matter how good an inductive argument is, there is some chance the conclusion is false. A deductive argument, ideally, if it's sound, if it's valid and it has true premises, there is no chance whatsoever the conclusion is false. In an inductive argument, there is always some chance. You can imagine a way that the conclusion could be false while the premises are true. The premises could be obviously true. The structure could be as good as you can imagine. Inductive arguments aren't valid, but there's ways to evaluate their structure too. And it's still possible the conclusion could be false. Here's an example. Smith in our logic book gives some examples. Here's another example though. Sam, that is me, has eaten peanut butter and other things with peanuts in them thousands of times and never noticed an allergic reaction. People are extremely unlikely to develop an allergy in middle age. It is safe for me to eat peanut butter, right? Probably, right? It's really unlikely I'm going to develop an allergy. It's really, really even more unlikely that I have one that I just somehow haven't noticed, but it could happen. There are people who develop really nasty peanut allergies in their 40s. God, I hope I'm not one of them. It's rare. It could happen. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to keep eating peanut butter, but I can imagine it happening, right? On the other side of the coin, I have a friend who's deathly allergic to peanuts. If he eats them, he has to take massive doses of Benadryl, uses EpiPen or he will die. It's always possible that he will just spontaneously recover, not be allergic to peanuts anymore, but he shouldn't go around trying to eat Reese's Cups, right? This brings me to a point. It is important to keep in mind that the possibility might be very, very, very low. The chances I will develop a nasty peanut allergy are low. I'm not going to lose any sleep over it, right? Smith's example, you've drank coffee from this coffee shop hundreds of times. It's always been safe. It's probably not going to be poisoned today. It's possible the mad poisoner will strike today, but, very, very unlikely. Now, it's important to keep in mind that inductive reasoning is not inferior to deductive reasoning. In a lot of cases, inductive reasoning will be all that we have. We can't always make good deductive arguments. In fact, inductive reasoning is probably a lot more common than deductive. Most of the reasoning we do to get through day-to-day life is inductive, right? You're going over to a friend's house and you're like, well, should we bring beer or dessert? And you're like, well, the last 5 times we've been there, he's always had really nice beer, but even when he has dessert, it's always terrible. We should bring dessert, right? It is possible, for everything you've said, that this might be the one time he doesn't have beer or wine or whatever, and he actually has a nice dessert for once. But you're still safe probably taking booze and not taking a dessert, right? So on and so forth. If 10 of your friends tell you that some professor is fun and an easy person to take a class from, well, he probably is, right? Always possible that something happens. This guy has some event and he becomes a hard nose overnight, but it's unlikely. Even though you can't rule that possibility out, you're not going to lose sleep over it, right? Honestly, deductive reasoning is the weird one. It is weird in a lot of ways. We do not have the certainty deductive reasoning claims in a lot of areas of life, and we don't demand it. So deductive reasoning is honestly kind of weird. So why study it? We'll say more about this. I think there's a few reasons. One, as Smith, our textbook author indicates, it's useful for thinking through the consequences of our beliefs and theories, what they commit us to, what is true if they are true. It's also useful for thinking through, what the beliefs or theories of others might commit them to, right? You know, if I accepted this crazy thing that I completely reject, what else would be true? Deductive reasoning is often a very good way of getting into the head of another person, right? Deductive reasoning also, and I think this is very, very valuable, it helps us to develop a very cautious and disciplined way of thinking. I took a class in deductive logic, and it's not like day to day that I use deductive logic, but it made me a lot more cautious, a lot more careful about the way I thought about things, which is good. And I think you'll also see deductive logic will teach you problem-solving strategies that are useful elsewhere. Some of the strategies I'm going to show you guys in this class I think are actually useful for other problems outside of class, hopefully. And then finally, deductive logic, if you learn it, especially formal deductive logic, is a very good foundation for learning inductive logic later. I actually thought about trying to do some inductive logic in this class, kind of shoehorning it in. I'm not going to do that, but if you do learn inductive logic, the first thing you'll have to learn is some very basic deductive logic, so this will help if you decide to learn that later.